used to seeing sinking ships in the movies. It's often really dramatic stuff. Ships exploding, sliding out of view beneath the waves as people flail about on the surface. But sometimes, surprisingly, real life could be even more dramatic than fiction. Ladies and gentlemen, after a short break, I'm still your friend, Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and today I'm very excited to have partnered with Getty Images to go through their archive and find some incredible real-life footage of sinking ships caught on film. Thousands and thousands of ships have sunk through history, but it was only recently that the camera has been around to be able to capture the drama of it all. There's nothing that quite grips the imagination of a sinking ship. Some more so than others. In 1956, the world's eyes were glued to their television screens as news came out from America that one of the newest, most luxurious ships afloat had been lost beneath the waves after a collision that had cost some 46 lives. Now this is probably one of the most widely reported on sinkings of all time because it happened with aircraft and helicopter crews buzzing around filming the whole thing. The SS Andrea Doria was a spectacular floating palace of a ship built for the Italian line. With the rise of the airliner and a slowing down of migrant numbers out of Europe, the Italian line intended to court the travelling public by building ships that were of exceptional quality and luxury. Instead of competing with Queen Elizabeth's size and United States' immense speed, Andrea Doria and her running mate, Cristoforo Colombo, were designed with comfort in mind. Over $12 million in today's currency was spent on her interior design and decor alone, and of course the ship was fitted with all the modern safety features one could hope for. All of this glamour and luxury mattered for little when, in a dense fog on the 26th of July 1956, just 5 years into her service career, Andrea Doria was rammed amidships by the Swedish liner Stockholm, and she began to slowly sink. What happened next was an absolute media sensation. Rescue ships, including the French liner Ile-de-France, rushed to the site and helicopters buzzed around. By the time the camera crews got to her, Andrea Doria was mostly evacuated and listing heavily over in the water, completely helpless. For her part, Stockholm remained afloat and was steaming for home with a grotesque wound, her bow completely telescoped and crushed beyond recognition. What played out was an orderly evacuation. Fortunately, Andrea Doria's safety features kept the ship afloat long enough for most aboard to evacuate safely. Tragically, nearly 50 people lost their lives, mostly in the initial collision when the Stockholm's bow had plunged deep into passenger staterooms and public areas. The Andrea Doria's list grew even more as water rushed into the ship, and soon the crew who had remained aboard were forced to abandon their posts when the situation proved helpless. Some 10 hours after the collision, Andrea Doria was finally pulled under the waves. The footage captured of the sinking ship is nothing short of remarkable. You can see the port propeller completely exposed as the ship rolls onto her side and sinks bow first. More than 1,500 people were rescued from the sinking vessel and taken back to New York, mostly aboard the Ile-de-France, followed closely by the Stockholm herself. Stockholm famously limped into New York Harbor, missing her entire bow section. Incredibly, a 14-year-old girl had been found badly injured in the crushed bow section of Stockholm, but she was not one of its passengers. She had been on the Andrea Doria when her cabin was smashed in, and when the two ships parted, she had been somehow tossed onto and caught up in Stockholm's wrecked forward end. Originally hailing from Mexico, she called out for her mother in Spanish. When a Spanish-speaking crew member of Stockholm's was found, she had asked, "I was on the Andrea Doria, where am I now?" She survived the encounter, but tragically, her little sister and her stepfather did not, although she was reunited with her mother, who had also been injured in the impact, and waited for news of her daughters in New York. Andrea Doria's wreck was visited by divers within a few weeks of the sinking, located easily by a huge slick of leaking oil. Divers took down a special underwater camera and filmed the descent until there, lying on her side, they found the wreck. You can see a lifeboat davit, still with its white paint, and the divers can be seen fighting the strong currents. Here's one swimming past one of the emergency lights that hung out over the side of the ship, high above the waterline to help guide lifeboats down as they launched. In the end, most of the fault for the Doria's loss was attributed to her own crew for having sped through the fog, ignored the laws of the sea as far as giving way, and not properly following radar procedures. In 2016, the underwater exploration company Oceangate completed a survey of the wreck using its Cyclops 1 submersible, revealing that the ship has decayed significantly and that the superstructure has almost completely collapsed. Now, just a few years before the Andrea Doria had been lost, a cargo ship had been battling its way through a very nasty storm. This was the C-1 class cargo ship named Flying Enterprise, built in 1944 as an American cargo vessel. After the war, she'd been sold off by the government to the Isbrandsten Company and used as a general cargo ship for about 5 years. In December 1951, she was steaming from Germany, bound for the US, when, on Christmas night, an enormous storm arose and battered the ship. She fared badly in the gale, and an enormous wave, possibly a rogue, smashed into her bow and cracked her hull. Flying Enterprise was carrying tons and tons of cargo, ranging from iron ore, coffee, and even 12 Volkswagen cars, and 10 passengers. But all now were in grave danger as the ship was smashed by monster waves and left drifting. Then, horrifyingly, the cargo shifted and the ship leaned over. 3 or so days later, the ship was listing way over to 45 degrees and a distress signal had been issued. The British vessel MV Sherborne arrived on station first, but incredibly, Flying Enterprise's Captain Carlson was reluctant to evacuate his passengers to a British vessel instead of an American one. The reasoning behind this isn't entirely clear. The ship was carrying some interesting materials, to be sure, including zirconium, which was used in the US nuclear program. So maybe Carlson was reluctant to risk this material falling into the hands of a British salvage crew. Whatever the case, in the end, an American warship arrived on scene, but only just in time, because the Flying Enterprise was clearly losing its fight to stay afloat. Attempts to tow the Flying Enterprise were made, but in the end, Captain Carlson abandoned his post, and she sank dramatically beneath the waves. A newsreel cameraman captured the whole drama as the superstructure began to dip below. She rolled onto her side, and her bow, still full of air, lifted high into the sky before being dragged down. One male passenger lost his life in the drama, and Flying Enterprise foundered some 300 miles, or 560 kilometers, off Cornwall. In the end, about a fourth of the ship's cargo was salvaged. Captain Carlson was hailed as a hero for his efforts to save the beleaguered ship, despite his strange reluctance to disembark his passengers aboard a British vessel. He was even given a ticker tape parade in New York. He died an old man and had his ashes scattered at Flying Enterprise's wreck site. And the whole drama presents us some of the most dramatic ship sinking footage ever captured on camera. Now, aside from the Andrea Doria, very, very few ocean liners have ever actually been captured sinking on film. But again, it was the 1950s that proved itself to be the decade for that kind of thing, when in 1953 the Dutch ocean liner Klipfontein sank after colliding with a mystery object. Klipfontein had been built just before the outbreak of the Second World War. A decently sized motor ship, she was powered by diesels and sat at around 10,500 gross registered tons and 520 feet, or 158 meters in length. The ship escaped the Nazi invasion during the Second World War and served as a troop ship for almost 7 years before finally being overhauled and introduced as a civilian ocean liner at the end of the war. Sailing from Amsterdam to southern and eastern Africa in 1953, the ship encountered some unknown underwater object. What this even was remains a mystery to this day, but it's thought to have been a reef, or even the remains of a half-sunken war wreck. Klipfontein rumbled in the water and began to flood rapidly. Sinking by the bow, her captain ordered the boats uncovered and loaded with passengers. Fortunately, the Union Castle steamship Bloemfontein Castle was at hand to help with the evacuation, and all passengers were got aboard safely. Not only that, but a photographer aboard the ship managed to capture the final moments on film as the stricken Dutch liner plunged into the ocean and her stern rose dramatically up into the air. This was watched in stunned awe by Bloemfontein Castle's passengers and Klipfontein's survivors who struggled to row their lifeboats in the choppy seas. In the end, all 234 passengers were evacuated safely in their 6 lifeboats in a calm and orderly manner over the course of just 1 hour, which is a pretty impressive effort. Flash forward from the 1950s to the year 1968, when a brand new, very modern roll-on, roll-off passenger ferry was caught in a particularly nasty storm and lost with 53 lives. Wahine was a gorgeously proportioned and superbly modern style of passenger and car ferry when first introduced in 1966. She was designed to carry passengers on the inter-island route in New Zealand, where the two main islands of the nation are separated by the notoriously volatile Cook Strait. Dozens of ships had been lost in this stretch of water, some with very serious loss of life. Wahine was so modern, comfortable, and big that her introduction resulted in the retirement of two much older ferries on the route. Just 2 years after her introduction, in April 1968, Wahine set out from Lyttelton for a normal overnight voyage to Wellington with 610 passengers and 123 crew on board. While she was underway, the unthinkable happened. Two massive, violent storm fronts collided over New Zealand and merged, creating an extratropical cyclone which has stood as the worst recorded in New Zealand's history. Winds roared in at 275 kilometers or 171 miles per hour, tearing roofs off of houses and blowing trucks clean into the air. At sea, Wahine battled the wind and the waves, but with a huge swell and barely under control, the ship lost her radar and was pushed clean onto a reef. She slammed and dragged her entire 8,000-ton bulk along the reef, gouging out her steel plates and opening her side clear to the water. Passengers mustered and put on their life jackets, but outside, the winds howled and the sea was driven into spray. With the ship grounded fast and not in any danger of sinking, her captain dropped anchors and determined to try to cling to the rocks until the wind and the weather died down enough to effect a rescue. For around 6.5 hours, Wahine held there until she was swung around and blown into deeper water. She now began to list heavily into the pounding waves, and the captain had no choice but to order his vessel finally abandoned. Only the boats on the starboard side closest to the water could be lowered. But then, something horrifying happened. The first boat was capsized on launching and its occupants were thrown into the ocean and mostly lost. Life rafts were launched, but the tiny craft were no match for the towering waves, and many who clung to them were swept away. The ship rolled onto her starboard side and sank in only 28 feet or 12 meters of water. Groups of bedraggled passengers made their way ashore, frozen nearly solid by the wind and the spray. Some who made it ashore even died of exposure, simply waiting for rescue. Incredibly, all these scenes were captured on film as rescue ships arrived to reveal the pathetic hulk of the beautiful, modern Wahine stranded on the rocks, leaning hard over. Wahine was broken up where she lay and sold for scrap. In the end, it was found that some errors of judgment on approach to Wellington Harbour had been made, but crucially, if the captain had ordered the abandoning of his ship any earlier or any later, then more lives would have been lost because the storm was just that bad, and he had found the one time where it was relatively safest to abandon ship. Now, this next incredible bit of footage is extremely rare because it shows something really bizarre: the sinking of a lightship. These little vessels carried large beacons and lit the way for approaching ships, but it also often put them in harm's way. In August 1967, the Newarp Lightship 83 was being towed for refit in the North Sea when she was somehow hit by a passing Polish tanker and began to take on water. The crew were evacuated, but then, thinking they could save their ship, the engineers and her skipper went back on board to do their best. A tow line was attached, but it was just too late, because the point of no return was reached, and the small ship rolled over onto her starboard side. A nearby vessel, potentially a British tug, captured the whole thing on camera, including these amazing scenes of the lightship's engineers and captain simply awaiting rescue sitting on the side of their capsized vessel. But in the end, after a 40-year-long career, the lightship slipped beneath the waves and was lost forever. Now, finally, we'll end on what is, in my opinion, probably some of the most incredible bit of footage ever taken of anything. That's the destruction of the HMS Barham. HMS Barham was one of the 5 legendary Queen Elizabeth-class battleships laid down and launched during the First World War. She'd served as a British flagship and was present at the epic Battle of Jutland. Modernised during the 20s and 30s, she was back in the fray for the Second World War. In November 1941, Barham was sailing in convoy with other warships from the 1st Battle Squadron with a heavy destroyer escort when their engine noise was picked up by a German U-boat. U-331 manoeuvred herself into a position to attack when it itself was detected by one of the lead destroyers. But the sonar contact was disregarded as an error or a false reading, and the German submarine slipped through the net. At virtually point-blank range, U-331 fired all 4 of her bow torpedo tubes into the Barham's side at just 345 meters or 410 yards distance. All 4 torpedoes hit home in virtually the same spot on Barham's hull, completely overwhelming any kinds of armor or anti-torpedo bulges and opening her machine spaces to the ocean. The ship immediately began to roll onto her port side as her crew desperately tried to escape. There was simply no time to lower the lifeboats. Barham simply rolled out from underneath them, trapping many of the men inside. And then, as her funnel, which still gouted thick black smoke, began to slip beneath the waves, there was a flash, and her powder magazines erupted. Like a volcano blowing out the side of a mountain, Barham simply disintegrated as her main magazines detonated. In a flash, hundreds of men who had still been clinging to the ship's side were simply vaporized, and horrifically some 862 men were lost with their proud ship. From the destroyer HMS Valiant, a news cameraman filmed the entire thing in one shot, but the world would not see this footage for years. The catastrophic destruction of HMS Barham was thought by the British Admiralty to have potential to be such a devastating blow to morale that any spread of its news was heavily censored. Several weeks later, next of kin messages were sent out finally, but any mention of the ship's loss was minimised, and even then, the letters included a warning not to discuss the vessel's loss. 3 months later, the Admiralty was at last forced to admit that the ship had sunk, but the newsreel footage of the explosion was kept under wraps until well after the war had ended, and it was at last screened to a curious general public. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.